The moment she screamed, "Get out of my kitchen!" something inside me cracked. This was my house, my space, my life, and my own son stood there clapping, smiling as if my humiliation were entertainment. In that instant, I realized the betrayal did not begin with money or documents. It began much earlier, in silence, in disrespect, in the slow erosion of dignity I had allowed for years. What followed was not revenge fueled by anger, but a reckoning shaped by truth, boundaries, and consequences that arrived faster than any of them expected. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 62 years old, a widow, and I live in a quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon, where mornings arrive slowly and evenings settle in with a kind of familiar calm. For most of my adult life, silence has not frightened me. I learned to live with it, to respect it, even to need it. After everything I survived, quiet felt earned. The house I live in is a 2-story wooden home with pale siding and wide windows that catch the afternoon light. I bought it more than 25 years ago, after spending decades working in port logistics, a field that taught me patience, precision, and endurance. Nothing about my life came quickly. I worked long shifts, managed contracts, tracked shipments through storms and labor disputes, and saved carefully. This house was not a gift or an inheritance. It was the result of consistency, discipline, and years of showing up even when I was tired. My husband died when Daniel, our son, was still young. The accident shattered the future we had imagined and left me standing alone with a child who depended on me for everything. From that moment on, my life narrowed its focus. I became the provider, the protector, and the steady presence Daniel needed. I packed lunches, attended school meetings, worked overtime, and learned how to stretch every dollar without making my son feel deprived. I told myself that if he grew up kind, responsible, and secure, then every sacrifice would be worth it. For a long time, I believed I had succeeded. Daniel grew into a polite young man, went to college, found work in technology, and eventually married Lauren. When they told me they were struggling financially and needed a temporary place to stay, I did not hesitate. I never asked how long temporary meant. I never asked for rent. This was my son. This was my home. To me, those facts were inseparable. I adjusted my routines without thinking twice. I cooked dinners that worked around their schedules. I kept the house quiet in the mornings so they could sleep in. I told myself that being useful was the same as being needed. That belief came naturally to me. I had spent my whole life placing other people's comfort ahead of my own. At first, everything felt manageable. The house was fuller, noisier, but still familiar. Over time, though, subtle changes crept in. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Decisions about the house were made without my input. I noticed small things, like furniture being moved or groceries disappearing faster than usual. But I brushed the thoughts aside. I did not want to be the mother who hovered or complained. I told myself that families adjust, that compromise was part of love. Still, there were moments when I felt oddly out of place, like a guest overstaying her welcome. I would stand in my own living room and feel as though the space no longer responded to me the way it once had. The walls were the same. The floor still creaked in the same spots, yet something fundamental had shifted. I blamed myself for those thoughts. I told myself it was age or loneliness or pride. I believed that if I stayed quiet and accommodating, things would settle back into balance. I believed that blood and history would protect me from real harm. What I did not understand then was that my silence was being interpreted not as kindness, but as permission. And while I was clinging to the idea of family, something far more dangerous was quietly taking shape inside the house I built with my own hands. If you are still watching and starting to sense the quiet and balance in this home, comment number 1 below so I know you are with me. What comes next is the moment where small disrespect turns into something much darker. Now, let us move on to chapter 2. The kitchen had always been the heart of my home. It was where my mornings began, where I measured time not by clocks, but by the sound of water boiling and coffee brewing. That morning felt no different at first. Pale Oregon light filtered through the window above the sink, resting on the worn wooden counter I had wiped down thousands of times. I moved through the space by habit, not thought, reaching for the mug I had used for years, listening to the quiet hum of the house waking up. Since Daniel and Lauren moved in, the kitchen had slowly stopped feeling like mine, though I could not have explained exactly when that happened. Cabinets were rearranged, familiar tools vanished, new items appeared without comment, shiny and unused, as if meant to replace something older and less worthy. I told myself it was harmless. Young people like things their way. It was easier to step aside than to argue. Lauren entered the kitchen more often now, her presence sharp and impatient. She moved quickly, with the confidence of someone who believed she belonged everywhere she stood. I noticed how she watched me sometimes, not with curiosity, but with judgment, as if measuring how much space I took up. I kept my head down and focused on what I was doing. Silence had always been my way of keeping peace. That morning, I was standing at the stove, stirring slowly, when I felt her behind me before I heard her. The air changed. There was tension in the room, sudden and unmistakable. She complained about the smell, about the way things were arranged, about how I was in the way. Her voice grew louder, faster, fueled by something deeper than irritation. Then she screamed, "Get out of the kitchen! This isn't your space anymore!" The words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I truly thought I had misunderstood. My hands froze. The spoon hovered above the pot. My chest tightened, as if the room had lost its air. I looked around, confused, waiting for someone to correct what had just been said. Daniel appeared in the doorway. I looked at my son, searching his face for recognition, for embarrassment, for anything that told me this had gone too far. Instead, he laughed. He clapped his hands once, sharp and loud, like he was watching a scene unfold for his entertainment. That sound stayed with me longer than the words did. It was not just approval, it was dismissal. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask how my kitchen had become someone else's territory. I felt something close over inside me, a reflex built from years of choosing endurance over conflict. I turned off the stove and stepped away, my movements careful and controlled, as if sudden motion might shatter me completely. As I left the room, I became aware of how small I felt, not physically, but emotionally, as if the role I had lived in for decades had been quietly erased. I was no longer the mother who built this home. I was no longer the woman whose effort had paid for every inch of it. I was something inconvenient, something to be moved aside. I walked down the hallway and closed my bedroom door. Only then did my hands begin to shake. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, replaying the moment over and over, trying to understand how it had happened so easily. How a lifetime of sacrifice could be reduced to a joke in a matter of seconds. I did not cry right away. What I felt was heavier than sadness. It was the realization that the rules had changed and no one had bothered to tell me. That moment in the kitchen was not just an outburst, it was a declaration, a line drawn without my consent. And as I sat there in silence, I understood something I had been avoiding for months. If I continued to stay quiet, this would not be the last thing taken from me. If you are still here and beginning to feel how silence can become a trap, comment number 2 below to let me know you are following closely. The next chapter reveals the first crack that can no longer be ignored. Now, let us move on to chapter 3. After the morning in the kitchen, I told myself I would let things settle. I returned to my routines with deliberate care, moving through the house quietly, as if calm behavior might smooth over what had happened. But something fundamental had shifted. The walls felt closer. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. Small details began to catch my attention. A utility bill arrived without my name on it. I assumed it was a clerical error until another followed, then another. When I checked the mailbox, there were days it seemed lighter than usual, as if some letters had been redirected before I ever saw them. I noticed that when Daniel paid household expenses, he no longer asked for confirmation. He simply said it was handled. I asked him about it one evening, keeping my tone even and light. He waved it off, saying it was easier to consolidate accounts and manage things digitally. He spoke quickly, without meeting my eyes, and the explanation ended before it truly began. I told myself not to read into it, yet the unease lingered. I had worked in logistics long enough to recognize when processes changed without transparency. Convenience was often the excuse people used when they did not want questions. Lauren grew more distant in small but telling ways. She took phone calls in closed rooms and lowered her voice when she noticed me nearby. When I entered a space, conversations stopped or shifted topics abruptly. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I watched. I listened. I reminded myself that reactions mattered more than words. The moment that turned my discomfort into real concern came unexpectedly. A former colleague, someone I had known for years, called me in the afternoon. He worked at the county records office and spoke carefully, choosing each word as if weighing its impact. He asked if everything was all right with my property. There had been paperwork submitted recently, he said, related to an adjustment in ownership records. Nothing finalized, nothing approved, but enough to raise questions. I felt my pulse quicken, though I kept my voice steady. I told him there must be a mistake. My house had never been discussed, never offered, never questioned. He did not argue. He simply advised me to look into it soon. When the call ended, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. I replayed recent weeks in my mind, connecting moments I had dismissed too easily. Lauren's confidence, Daniel's avoidance, the sudden urgency around finances I was not allowed to see, the way I had been pushed aside room by room, decision by decision. Part of me resisted the conclusion forming in my thoughts. Daniel was my son. I had raised him to be honest. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, one that did not involve betrayal. But another part of me, the part shaped by decades of managing risk and responsibility, could no longer ignore the pattern. Something was being done without my consent, and it involved the one thing I had worked my entire life to secure. I did not confront them. Not yet. I understood instinctively that open confrontation would only drive whatever was happening further into the shadows. Instead, I chose restraint. I needed clarity before emotion. I needed to know how far this went. That realization was painful in a way I had not anticipated. For the first time, I allowed myself to see Daniel not as the child I protected, but as an adult capable of making decisions that could harm me. That shift hurt more than anger ever could. From that day on, I paid closer attention. I noticed how often Lauren checked documents on her laptop late at night, I listened for tone rather than content when Daniel spoke. I stored away details, dates, inconsistencies. I was no longer simply enduring. I was preparing. By the end of the week, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer being ignored. I was being managed. And in their plans, I was not a partner or a priority. I was an obstacle. If you are still watching and felt that turning point hit a little too close to home, comment number 3 below, so I know you are still with me. What happens next shows what happens when patience finally runs out. Now, let us move on to chapter 4. In the days that followed, I made a conscious effort to behave as if nothing had changed. I woke early, kept my routines neat and predictable, and avoided any mention of paperwork, bills, or the kitchen. I believed that if I did not provoke tension, it might dissipate on its own. Peace, I had learned, often depended on endurance, so I endured. Daniel and Lauren, however, began acting differently. Their concern arrived suddenly and felt rehearsed. They asked how I was sleeping, whether I felt tired during the day, whether my joints hurt more than usual. The questions came with polite smiles and gentle tones, but they lingered too long, as if my answers were being recorded somewhere invisible. I recognized the pattern even before I wanted to admit it. I was being assessed. I noticed how often Lauren watched me when she thought I was distracted, her eyes narrowing slightly, measuring my movements. If I misplaced my keys or paused to remember a word, the moment did not pass unnoticed. Everything about me had become evidence. I was no longer simply living in my home. I was being evaluated inside it. One evening, Daniel asked if we could talk. He used the voice he reserved for professional conversations, calm and firm, stripped of warmth. We sat in the living room, the same space where I had once helped him with homework and listened to his dreams about the future. That familiarity made what came next hurt even more. He spoke about responsibility, about planning ahead, about how difficult it was to balance work and stress. Then he mentioned safety. He said the house might be too much for me, that managing stairs and maintenance could become dangerous. He spoke carefully, as if following a script. When he suggested looking into assisted living communities, his words were wrapped in concern, but his eyes betrayed urgency. I did not interrupt him. I listened as he described clean facilities, attentive staff, and social activities for people my age. The message beneath the words was unmistakable. I was being repositioned, gently but firmly, as a problem that needed solving, and the solution conveniently removed me from the house. Inside, something twisted sharply. This was not about my well-being. It was about control. It was about clearing the path to something they wanted and could not have while I remained. Still, I kept my face calm. I nodded. I said I needed time to think. That answer seemed to satisfy them both. After that conversation, my presence in the house diminished even further. Decisions were made without consulting me. Repairs were scheduled without my knowledge. Financial discussions stopped entirely when I entered the room. It was as if I had already begun to disappear. At night, lying awake in my bedroom, I replayed every interaction, every subtle shift. The pattern was too deliberate to ignore. This was not the confusion of a family under stress. It was strategy. I understood then that my earlier instincts had been correct. I was not being protected. I was being sidelined. Yet I did not confront them. Not then. I understood that reacting emotionally would only strengthen their narrative. If I appeared unstable or defensive, it would justify everything they were doing. So I remained quiet, not out of fear, but out of calculation. By the end of the week, the truth had settled heavily but clearly in my mind. I was no longer viewed as the foundation of this household. I was an obstacle standing between them and something they believed they deserved. And if I wanted to protect what was mine, I would have to stop pretending that patience alone could save me. That realization marked the end of my hesitation. I knew then that what came next would not be subtle, and I also knew that I would need to be far more deliberate than I had ever been before. If you are still here and wondering how deep this betrayal truly goes, comment number 4 below to let me know you are staying with the story. The next chapter is where everything explodes. Now, let us move on to chapter 5. I reached a point where observation alone felt like surrender. The quiet strategy that had once protected me now threatened to cost me everything. So I did what I had always done when something mattered. I gathered facts, carefully, quietly, without announcing my intentions to anyone living under my roof. I contacted a lawyer I trusted, someone who specialized in property law and understood discretion. I did not explain the family dynamics. I simply asked him to check the status of my home, to tell me whether anything unusual had been filed in recent weeks. I told myself there was still room for error, for misunderstanding. I wanted confirmation before fear turned into certainty. The confirmation came faster than I expected. There had been paperwork submitted to the county, incomplete but deliberate, referencing an adjustment to ownership records. Nothing had gone through, not yet, but the attempt existed. My name had not been removed, but it had been positioned as temporary, as something that could be amended with the right signatures and timing. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, though I remained outwardly calm. The lawyer dug deeper. What he found painted a picture that no longer allowed for innocence. Daniel and Lauren were drowning in debt, more than $300,000 spread across failed investments, personal loans, and obligations they could no longer service. The urgency I had sensed, the sudden push to reorganize my life, the quiet removal of my authority, all of it now made terrible sense. My house was not a home to them. It was leverage. Each new detail connected seamlessly to the last. The questions about my health, the assisted living brochures placed casually on the counter, the way finances had been rerouted without discussion. They were not worried about me. They were preparing to move around me. What hurt most was not the strategy itself, but the realization that Daniel was not a bystander swept along by his wife. The evidence showed planning, coordination, intent. He was not confused. He was involved. That truth settled heavily in my chest, heavier than anger, heavier than grief. It was the death of an illusion I had protected for years. I sat alone that evening, the house unusually quiet, and let the weight of it sink in. I thought about the boy I had raised, the nights I stayed awake worrying about his future, the pride I felt watching him become an adult. I questioned whether I had been blind or simply hopeful. In the end, the answer did not matter. Responsibility could not be undone by regret. What surprised me was my own reaction. I did not feel the urge to confront them immediately. I did not feel the need to cry or shout. Instead, something inside me sharpened. The emotional fog cleared, replaced by a precise awareness of what was at stake. This was not about hurt feelings anymore. This was about survival, autonomy, and dignity. I reviewed the documents again, noting dates, language, omissions. I paid attention to what had not been done yet. Timing mattered. They were close, but not finished. That detail gave me something invaluable: space. By the time I went to bed that night, the shape of the situation was unmistakable. This was not a misunderstanding that could be resolved with conversation. It was an attempt to remove me from my own life without my consent. And while the betrayal cut deeply, it also clarified something essential. I no longer needed to wonder whether I was imagining things. I knew exactly where I stood, and knowing that changed everything. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the settling of wood, the distant hum of traffic, every noise amplified by the weight of what I now knew. The place that had once sheltered me felt like a battlefield where nothing had exploded yet, but everything was armed. I understood with painful clarity that waiting any longer was no longer patience, it was risk.
Two paths stretched out in front of me, both sharp in different ways. I could call the authorities, hand over the documents, and let the law do what it was designed to do. The attempt to alter ownership records was real, deliberate, and serious. That path would end quickly and decisively, but it would also brand my son with consequences he could never fully escape. The other path was silence. If I said nothing, if I delayed, they would continue. The house would be repositioned, paperwork refined, and one day I might wake up with nowhere left to stand. What made the choice unbearable was not fear for myself, it was the collision of two truths that had always lived inside me. I was Daniel's mother, the woman who had protected him from every harm she could anticipate. But I was also the woman who had built a life with discipline and foresight, who understood that survival required boundaries. For the first time, those roles were no longer aligned. As the night deepened, my thoughts drifted backward, not to my son, but to myself. I remembered the early years in port logistics when I was often the only woman in the room. I remembered learning to negotiate contracts, to read risk before it announced itself, to plan 3 steps ahead because mistakes were expensive. I had learned to be invisible when necessary and decisive when the moment demanded it. Those skills had not disappeared simply because I became a mother. I had never shared that part of my life with Daniel in full. He knew I worked. He did not know how far I had gone or how much I still controlled. Over the years, I had quietly become a co owner in a regional shipping and transport operation along the Pacific Northwest, an enterprise built on long term partnerships and steady growth. It was not flashy, it did not announce itself, but it was strong, and it meant that the house was only one piece of a much larger foundation. I had chosen to live modestly on purpose. I wanted to know who valued me for my presence, not my resources. I wanted to believe that my son's love was uncomplicated by money. Realizing how wrong I had been hurt more than any financial threat ever could. By morning, my hesitation had burned away, leaving something colder but clearer in its place. I understood that love without limits was not kindness, it was surrender. If I allowed myself to be erased quietly, there would be nothing left to salvage, not for me and not for Daniel either. Consequences delayed too long did not disappear, they multiplied. I decided then that I would not expose everything immediately, not out of mercy, but out of strategy. I needed them to believe they were succeeding, to continue revealing themselves through action. I gathered my documents carefully, made copies, organized touch timelines. I prepared not for confrontation, but for clarity. As the sun rose and filled the house with light, I felt something shift inside me. The fear did not vanish, but it no longer controlled me. I accepted that whatever came next would change my family forever. And I accepted that protecting myself was no longer optional. There would be a moment when I stepped forward and spoke with my full voice. When that moment arrived, there would be no confusion about who I was or what I owned. Until then, I would wait deliberately with my eyes open. If you are still watching and feel the weight of that decision, comment number 6 below. So So I know you are still here. What follows are the consequences no one expected. Now let us move on to chapter 7. I chose the moment carefully, not in anger, not after another sleepless night, but on an ordinary afternoon when the house was quiet and there were no excuses to escape the conversation. I asked Daniel and Lauren to sit with me in the living room. My voice was calm, neutral. That alone made them uneasy. The room felt different with all three of us seated there, stripped of routine and distraction. No television murmured in the background. No phones were in their hands. The silence is stretched, heavy, and deliberate. I could feel their anticipation, the tension humming just beneath the surface. They knew something was coming, even if they did not yet know what. I began without accusation. Ye- I spoke about facts, not feelings. I told them I was aware that paperwork related to my house had been submitted to the county. I said I knew there were ongoing financial pressures they had not shared with me. I did not raise my voice. I did not list every detail I knew. I watched their faces instead. Daniel reacted first, instinctively denying any wrongdoing. His words came quickly, too quickly, layered with explanations that did not quite connect. As he spoke, his confidence faltered. His shoulders tightened. He stopped meeting my eyes. He understood in that moment that I was not guessing. Lauren's composure fractured more visibly. The ease she usually carried vanished, replaced by sharp defensiveness that quickly gave way to fear. She shifted in her seat, her hands clenched together, her gaze darting between Daniel and me as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. The woman who had once moved through my house with certainty now looked cornered. I did not interrupt them. I did not correct their half truths. I let the weight of what was unsaid fill the room. Years of working in negotiations had taught me that silence, used correctly, could be more revealing than any interrogation. The longer I waited, the more their stories unraveled on their own. Eventually, the denials slowed. Words dried up. What remained was a thick, suffocating quiet in which the truth sat plainly between us. Daniel's posture collapsed inward as if he finally understood the scope of what he had done. Lauren stared at the floor, her jaw tight, the mask of entitlement fully stripped away. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I looked at them and felt the last threads of illusion fall away. They were no longer the people I had been trying to protect from hardship. They were two adults who had made deliberate choices and now had to face the consequences of those choices. The realization hurt more than I expected, not because I still hope to be wrong, but because clarity often arrives with loss. I mourned quietly, not the house or the money, but the version of my family I had believed in for so long. The consequences were already unfolding, even without me stating them aloud. Daniel understood he had crossed a line that could not simply be stepped back over. Lauren understood that the security she had assumed was never hers to claim. The foundation they had built their plans on was no longer stable. I did not tell them what would happen next. That was not the purpose of this conversation. This was not a verdict, it was an unveiling. They needed to sit with the truth before anything else could be addressed. As the silence settled again, I felt an unexpected steadiness take hold. I was no longer reacting. I was directing. Whatever came next would be on my terms, not because I wanted power over them, but because I refused to be erased quietly. When I finally stood, ending the conversation without ceremony, I knew this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The hardest part was still ahead. Setting boundaries, enforcing them, and accepting the fallout would require more strength than silence ever had. But for the first time in a long while, I was not afraid. The house remained unusually quiet after that conversation. For hours, no one spoke. Doors opened and closed softly, footsteps careful, as if sound itself might provoke another reckoning. I allowed the silence to stretch. They needed time to absorb what had happened, just as I needed time to steady myself. Truth, once spoken, has a way of rearranging everything it touches. Oh, by the following morning, I understood that clarity alone was not enough. I had revealed what I knew, but without boundaries, nothing would truly change. I had spent years mistaking patience for peace, Bell stopped believing that love required endless flexibility. That belief had nearly cost me my home and my autonomy. I could not allow it to cost me my future. I asked Daniel and Lauren to sit with me again, this time at the dining table. My tone was calm, measured, and deliberate. I was not angry. Anger would have made this feel like a negotiation. This was not one. I spoke slowly, making sure each word landed exactly where it needed to. I told them they would need to move out of the house. Not immediately, but within a defined and reasonable period. This was not a punishment. It was a necessary separation. The house needed to return to being what it had always been for me, a place of safety, not strategy. Living together had blurred lines that should never have been crossed. Next, I made it clear that any involvement they had with my finances or property was over. No signatures, no discussions with third parties, no assumptions of authority. Any legal matters related to me would be handled solely through my lawyer. Eh, This was not about control, it was about protection. Finally, I addressed responsibility. Their debts, their obligations, their future decisions were theirs to manage. I would not step in to rescue them from consequences they had created themselves. If I chose to offer support later, it would be structured, transparent, and conditional, not emotional, not automatic. Daniel listened with his head lowered, the weight of shame evident in his posture. For the first time, he did not interrupt or defend himself. There was no argument left to make. What he faced now was not my anger, but my resolve. That was harder for him to push against. Lauren reacted differently. At first, there was a resistance in her body language, a tension that suggested she still wanted to challenge the limits I was setting. But as I continued, as it became clear that there was no flexibility to exploit, that resistance softened. Reality has a way of doing that. I did not ask for agreement. I did not wait for apologies. Boundaries do not require permission to exist. They require enforcement, and I was prepared to enforce mine. When the conversation ended, nothing felt resolved in a comforting way. There were no reassurances, no promises of reconciliation. What existed instead was structure, or clear lines where there had once been ambiguity. If that structure felt unfamiliar, even painful, but it also felt solid. As I stood alone afterward, looking around the house that had witnessed so many versions of my life, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. This was the only path forward. It would change my relationship with my son. It would challenge the future I had imagined, but it would preserve something far more important. My dignity was no longer negotiable. If you are still here and ready to see how this story truly ends, comment number 8 below to let me know you stayed until the final turning point. The conclusion holds the lesson that changes everything. Now, let us move on to the final chapter. The days after they moved out passed without drama, marked instead by small, ordinary moments that felt strangely significant. The house adjusted first. The suns no longer pressed in on me, it expanded, giving me room to breathe. I noticed how quickly familiar rhythms returned, how the creak of the stairs and the hum of the refrigerator sounded like old friends welcoming me back. Daniel and Lauren packed methodically, keeping to themselves. Boxes lined the hallway for a week, then disappeared one by one. I stayed out of the process, not because it did not hurt, but because interference would have blurred the line I had worked so hard to draw. Watching my son dismantle pieces of his childhood was painful in a quiet, aching way. Yet, alongside that ache came relief. The tension that had lived in the walls for months was finally dissolving. Daniel changed during that time and he spoke less, but when he did, there was no defensiveness, no explanations. He accepted the boundaries without testing them, and that mattered more to me than any apology could have. Responsibility, I learned, often shows itself through restraint. It is not loud or dramatic, it is simply there. Lauren kept her distance. She moved through the house carefully, as if unsure of her footing. The confidence that once filled every room was gone, replaced by something more cautious. I did not interpret that as guilt or growth. I saw it as consequence. Entitlement fades when it no longer has shelter. The day they left arrived quietly. A car filled the driveway, doors closed. Daniel hesitated before stepping toward me, then embraced me with uncertainty. I returned the gesture gently. There were no promises exchanged, no reassurances offered. Love did not require that anymore. Honesty did. When they drove away, I walked through the house alone. I touched the backs of chairs, straightened a picture frame, paused in doorways where arguments had once hovered unspoken. Nothing felt empty. It felt reclaimed. I opened the window and let the air move freely, carrying away what no longer belonged. In the weeks that followed, I turned my attention back to my own life. I finalized legal protections, not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. I reconnected with work and colleagues who knew me as decisive and capable. The version of me that had shrunk to accommodate others began to unfold again. Daniel reached out occasionally, not to ask for help, but to share progress, updates about work, about learning to manage on his own. I listened without guiding, without correcting. That was part of the boundary, too. Growth cannot be borrowed. What remained between us was not the closeness I once imagined, but something more honest, fragile, perhaps, but grounded in reality. It would have to be rebuilt carefully if it survived at all. As for me, I settled into the life I had nearly lost. The house became my sanctuary again, not because it was quiet, but because it reflected truth. I did not feel victorious. I felt resolved. Some endings do not close with certainty, they simply leave you standing in what remains, learning how to live there. Time did not erase what happened, but it reshaped it. As the months passed, The sharp edges softened, not because I forgot, but because I finally understood. Healing did not arrive as forgiveness or reunion, it arrived as clarity. I learned that peace is not the reward for enduring pain, it is the result of choosing yourself when endurance becomes self betrayal. My days grew quieter in a different way. I no longer woke up scanning for tension. I moved through my home without shrinking my presence. The silence felt surrendered, not imposed. For the first time in years, my thoughts belonged to me alone, unburdened by the need to anticipate someone else's moods or demands. That freedom was subtle but profound. My relationship with Daniel changed, and I accepted that it had to. We spoke less often, but more honestly. There were no expectations hidden beneath our conversations, no unspoken debts. I did not rush forgiveness, and I did not promise it. Trust, I realized, is not rebuilt by apologies or regret. It grows only when actions remain steady over time. Whether that growth would happen was not something I could control, and learning to release that control was part of my healing. Lauren stayed at a distance, and I allowed it. I felt no need to punish or confront her further. Understanding someone's fears does not require sacrificing your own well being. Compassion without boundaries is not virtue, it is erasure. That lesson, once learned, stayed with me. What surprised me most was how fully I returned to myself. I was no longer defined solely by motherhood or loss. I was reminded that before all of that, I had been a woman with discipline, ambition, and strength. Reclaiming those parts of myself did not make me colder, it made me whole. I began sharing my story quietly with other women my age, women who had spent decades giving until there was almost nothing left. I saw recognition in their eyes, the same fear of being called selfish for wanting fairness. I wanted them to know what I had learned too late to avoid pain, but not too late to matter. Dignity is not something you earn by suffering, it is something you protect by setting limits. I still love my son, that truth remains. But now I love myself as well, and that has changed everything. Loving myself allowed me to choose honesty over illusion, boundaries over silence, and peace over performance. This house remains my home, not because I defended it, but because I reclaimed the woman who belonged in it. I will never again allow myself to fade into the background of my own life. Knowing my worth was the most important thing I ever built. In the end, this story is not about conflict or loss, but about awakening. It is about the quiet moment when endurance turns into awareness and awareness becomes strength. Life often teaches its hardest lessons late, not to punish but to refine. Boundaries are not walls built out of bitterness, they are lines drawn out of wisdom. Respect is not something granted by others, but something claimed from within. When illusions fall away, what remains may feel fragile at first, yet it is far more honest than what came before. True peace is not found in pleasing everyone, but in no longer abandoning yourself. Growth rarely looks dramatic from the outside, but internally, it can change everything. And sometimes, reclaiming your voice is the bravest act of love you will ever make. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore strength, dignity, and self worth.